to Ron Martin about his experiences in the Vietnam War. First of all, where were you born?
I was born in Muncie, Indiana.
Muncie, Indiana? When was this?
I was born in 1945.
Could you talk a bit about growing up, about your family? Do you have a large family?
No, I am the middle of three sons, and my father was an insurance agent, and my mother was a stay-at-home mother, and all three of us boys went to Burris High School, which at the time was a neighborhood school. If you lived in the neighborhood, you walked to school, which is what we did. And then when we completed high school, my older brother, who's 6 years my senior, went on to Hanover College. And my younger brother and I, my younger brother's 4 years my junior, we both went to Indiana University.
What did you study at IU?
Business, with an emphasis on insurance. I thought I might follow my dad's footsteps.
All right. Was there any history of military service in your family?
Not to my knowledge. My dad's number was never called. He was at the right age to go to World War II, but it was never called.
You said your father was selling insurance, and you were looking to what type of insurance?
Well, my dad was primarily in the property and casualty business, and I pursued the life insurance into the business. And so eventually when got finished with school and the military and all that, I went to work for the Travelers Insurance Company in their sales representative trainee program in Indianapolis, Indiana, and that was a 3-year gig. And following that, my dad had a property and casualty agency up here in Muncie, and then another partner at the time named Don Stelzer. And they said, why don't you come complement what we're doing by opening a life shop in our P&C agency, and that's what my wife and I did.
All right. When did you enlist in the military?
When did
you volunteer?
Well, I didn't volunteer.
Oh, you didn't volunteer?
No. Yes and no. When I went to a state-supported school, which was Indiana University, in 1963, ROTC was compulsory. And they had two programs. They had the Army program and they had the Air Force program. And I signed up for the Air Force because when I was a kid growing up, I loved airplanes. I used to build model planes. I'd write to all the major airplane companies and get posters that were on my wall. I had battle scenes hanging from my ceiling. I was just really into planes and flying. I thought that being in the Air Force was something I'd like to do. You had to enroll in ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, your freshman and sophomore year at that time. And so I enrolled in the Air Force ROTC, and my vision started to fade on me. So I washed out of the physical. I could not pass the physical to fly. And the commitment with the Air Force was 4 years, and then any reserve commitment following your 4 years of active duty. The Army commitment was for 2 years active duty and then 2 years reserve. Well, I didn't particularly want to be on the ground in the Air Force for 4 years. So I took the 2 years that were mandatory and I quit, as most people did. ROTC, dropped out, pursued different things. But Vietnam was heating up, and I was in a fraternity down there, and several of my fraternity brothers and I thought, we may end up getting drafted and go to Vietnam. It probably is better to, rather than have some green lieutenant tell us to go take that hill in Vietnam, if we were that green lieutenant saying, hey, go take that hill. So we thought about our options. Air Force 4 years, we're already a semester behind. Army 2 years. And we went over to the Army Department and said, we want to know if we could possibly get into your program. And for the 2-year commitment. Here's our background, so forth. And the Army said, if you'll make up for the semester you've lost, make good grades, keep your nose clean, we'll let you in. So it was through the ROTC program that I entered into the service.
What fraternity were you in?
I was in Sigma Alpha Epsilon.
All right. So, what year did you finally go to Vietnam?
I went in 68.
68. Where were you stationed?
In Vietnam. It was a base camp called Dong Tam, which was down in the 4th quarter of South Vietnam, down south, on the Mekong River.
Right. You were in medical operations, correct?
That's correct.
What was your job there?
Well, when I first arrived at the 9th Medical Battalion, which was attached to the 9th Infantry, I was what they call excess. In other words, I was extra. They didn't actually have a slot or a position for me. And I remember that the CO, commanding officer for a medical unit, has to have a medical degree. And our CO was a guy named Joseph Lloyd, who was a psychiatrist of all things. But he was from Anderson, Indiana. Small world, huh? An infantry unit came through and they said, we need a medical lieutenant. And Colonel Lloyd said, well, I've got one, but I've got plans for him. I'm not going to let you have him. And I thought, just the connection between Anderson and Muncie, he kept me around, maybe saved my life, because I could have been out in the boonies with the infantry in a much more hazardous position than I was. So I moved into the first position that was available. I was a motor pool officer, had to take care of the motor pool. And then eventually the job opened up for me where I was the medical operations assistant. I took a captain's place that went back to the States. And basically that was being the administrative officer of a 50-bed holding company, or in other words, we were a very small hospital. We didn't do major surgery. And so I was supposed to run the show as far as the administrative part was concerned, and my commanding officer was a medical doctor. So that's what I did. You know, you did various things like making sure that all the medical shifts were covered, that the dust-offs that came in were administered properly. We ran the morgue for the entire 9th Division to see that was properly maintained and administered, and that just things ran accordingly to SOP, standard operating procedures, military term.
Did you have an opinion on the Vietnam War before you went in?
Probably. I thought it was for God and country, and I was proud to serve my country and do my part in what was necessary. That's probably the way I felt going in.
How did you expect the experience to be before you went? Did you have any expectations?
No, I don't think so. I went to my advanced infantry training at Fort Riley in Kansas, and it was infantry training, so we prepared for ground fighting and prepared at that time when there was a war going on for the enemy being the North Vietnamese. So that's kind of what I expected we would be getting into were I to go to Vietnam. But of course in my ROTC experience and my preliminary medical training experience at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, and then at Fort Lewis, Washington, I still didn't have orders for Vietnam, so there was a chance I wouldn't be going because not everyone went to Vietnam that was in the military. So I held out hope that maybe I wouldn't be sent, wouldn't be deployed.
When you did arrive in Vietnam, could you describe what it was like first being there? Sights, sounds, smells?
Well, yeah, we got off of a commercial airliner. I think in Long Binh, it might have been Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base, I'm not sure about that. But it was very, very hot, and some of the other GIs that had been there for a while were yelling short when they saw us. Didn't exactly know what that meant. We might even have seen some body bags being loaded on other plates. Short meant that you don't have much time to go. They were letting us know that they had served their time. We had 365 days to go, and they may have had 20 or 30, and they were proud of that and rubbing it in, so to speak.
Did you have much interaction with the Vietnamese citizens while you were stationed?
Only those that would come to our base camp. And I should back up a little bit, because when I first arrived in Vietnam, the 9th Division had just moved from a base camp called Bearcat down to the Mekong Delta. And so new lieutenants, regardless of the branch, Medical Service Corps, Infantry, Armor, whatever, engineers, that were coming into the country on the plane I was in, we had to get acclimated to the country, get our Vietnam issue, our fatigues, our boots, and all that, because we all had stateside issue before that, which are different clothing. And we had to go through some basic training at Bearcat, which had been abandoned. So we had to go out on night patrols, do some training in that area. So I was there for about 2 weeks before I was actually shipped down to the 9th Medical Battalion. Part of our training was to go out on night patrol, and I had been there for about 3 or 4 days, and a group was gathered together and assigned to go on night patrol, and they went out while it was still light, and they spent the night outside the perimeter of the base camp, and they would set a perimeter outside of their small bivouac area. And to do that, they would go set claymore mines. I don't know if you're familiar with what a claymore mine is or not. They would set the claymore mines, and then they would come back into the area, and that way they'd have some perimeter, some defense perimeter, where they'd hear the enemy out there. They could fire the claymores. Well, I don't know what happened in the training, but this group of maybe 6 or 8 guys, brand new green lieutenants, as I was, that had just been in the country for a few days, went out, and one of them did not follow his claymore mine lines in that he laid out to his claymore mine. He came in a different direction. Someone heard him coming in, thought he was the enemy, and opened fire, and messed him up pretty badly. And I thought, you know, if this is the kind of training that we're going to have as soon as we get in country, this is not a good thing. And so I was a little bit shell-shocked my first week in country. Then I made it through that and got transferred down to Dong Tam and found out that the Viet Cong had tunneled to within 50 or 100 yards of the perimeter of Bearcat. So they were moving in pretty quickly where we were located. So there were a lot of things that were pretty frightening. Could have gone pretty badly. I was very fortunate. I was never wounded. I came very close once to being wounded, but I'm one of the lucky ones.
The medical facilities you worked in, how did they compare to hospitals in the U.S.? Were they adequately stocked?
Well, no. I wouldn't say that they would compare to hospitals in the U.S. We were like a sorting area. In other words, we even had a dental unit attached to us, so we could do some, we had a group of dentists, and we could do some dental procedures and things like that. Anything really serious that came in medically, then there was a surgical hospital right next door to us called the 3rd Surgical Hospital, and so the nasty stuff went over there for them to work on. But have you ever seen MASH? we were closer to being like a MASH unit as far as size and function. So, you know, we didn't take anything very serious for very long. But that was our capacity to take on lesser medical needs, or to treat them immediately and then move them to where they should go.
Over the phone, you said that while working there, you did come under fire?
Yes.
About how often would that occur?
Well, at least every couple of weeks, we'd come under fire from mortar and rockets. We had a berm around us, so gunfire probably wouldn't be real effective unless they got up to the berm, and they usually didn't. So it was usually mortar and rockets, and we could build bunkers, which was you build a building, then you build a building outside of it, maybe 3 feet, 2 feet larger, and you fill it full of sandbags. That will stop a mortar, but won't stop a rocket. Most defenses against rockets were tunnels where you could dig down. Well, Dong Tam was essentially a silt pad where, I don't know who, I suppose the Corps of Engineers had pumped the Mekong River into these rice paddies and built it up, so now we had ground, and that's what the whole base camp was built upon. But nevertheless, your elevation was probably about 2 feet, 2 or 3 feet, so you couldn't dig down. So there was always the paranoia that when a rocket came in, there wasn't a whole lot that could stop it. They could slow it down, but you weren't fully protected against rockets. And I believe that they fired, the siren went off, and they fired green flares if we were under ground attack, and red flares if we were under air attack or mortar attack. And so I've never adjusted to the 4th of July since then. Memories.
Did you hear from friends and family very often while you were in Vietnam?
Yes, I got mail frequently. I had been married for 6 months before I was deployed, before I got my orders. And I probably would not have gotten married had I thought I was going to Vietnam, but I guessed that one wrong. So I received mail frequently, care packages, which were chocolate chip cookies and things of that nature.
What did you write home about?
Well, that's kind of hard for me to remember, really, except I remember my mother saying that my letters the first month when I first got in the country, maybe when I was in Bearcat, which I mentioned before, she said I sound like a completely different person. She didn't like the sound of it at all. And so apparently I was pouring out my heart and telling them of my fears. And I don't remember that, and had she not mentioned it, I still wouldn't remember it. But I think after I got situated, I probably refrained, after I got acclimated, refrained from telling them about the rocket and the mortar attacks and being under fire and that sort of thing. I didn't want them to carry that burden. I just wanted them to keep me in their prayers.
You had no medical experience. You were purely like an administrative position. But did you ever assist in any minor operations?
Not that I was needed, but sometimes I did. I would give shots. I would observe in minor operations. I think I might even have done some suturing at some time. Of course, when I had my basic medical training at Fort Sam Houston, then we went through basic medical procedures, so I learned some things there, but not anything that a doctor would do.
All right. Back home, the war was becoming increasingly unpopular. What did you think about the protesters while you were in Vietnam? Did you pay them much mind?
Well, I wasn't aware of them much when I was over there. My younger brother was a protester, and when I was off fighting the war, he was protesting the war down at Indiana University, and so I've kind of missed all that. I found out, I believe, how unpopular the war was at home after I got home. I might also add something that you haven't asked about, but when I was the motor pool officer, and well, actually, I can't remember if it was then or it was when I was in charge of the med station, and we would come under fire. We were not allowed to go out when the calls would come in. The particular unit, infantry unit, artillery unit, engineer unit within the base camp had been hit, that there was need for medical help. We were not supposed to go out to that area to administer medical aid until the all clear had been given. My medics defied those orders. They jumped in ambulances and they went out. Well, we're still under fire, and they administered medical attention, and they saved lives. They came back with the ambulances full of holes from shrapnel. And these medics that did this, these were COs, conscientious objectors, that some called chicken because they were COs. They were anything but chickens. They were heroes. They just didn't want to shoot anybody. They didn't want to carry a gun. They didn't want to be involved in that end of the war. But when it came to sucking it up and saving somebody's life, they were truly heroes. And I had a much better, or a much different, and of course better opinion of what a CO was once I lived with them for a while than what I had mistakenly been led to believe prior to that experience.
So you said the COs went against the officers' orders and went out with the ambulances while under fire. Was there ever any consequence to that?
Admonishment, but we would never write them up or court-martial them or anything like that.
I see.
I mean, they'd save some people's lives. That's pretty big.
What was it like to come home after the war? What was it like your first few years back home?
It was a little difficult because there was the idea that you were baby killers among some of the population. So I'd have to say that I had some paranoia for a while, not anxious to admit that I had been in the war. You never knew what someone's opinion was going to be. So I was a little leery of things for a while.
Did you ever face a direct confrontation?
Not that I recall. Not personally that I recall.
What year was this, by the way, when you came back?
1969. I was in time for Woodstock, but no one had told me about it. I feel so badly about that. Just kidding.
What did you do after the war?
I was hired by the Travelers a month or so before I left for Vietnam. They said, when you get back, you can start in this training program. And so right after I got back, my wife had already found an apartment in Indianapolis, and I just went to work, learning what my career would be.
Sorry. How do you think your administrative position has affected your career? Do you think it's had an effect on your work?
Oh, I think so. I think when you're in a position of management and you're responsible for a certain mission that can carry over, and I've been involved in this insurance agency that's had as many as 18 employees. I've been involved in other organizations through my insurance industry, from my state association and other boards of directors that I've served on in leadership capacities that I think all went back to some of my leadership training in the military.
How's your service in general affected the way you live now?
Well, I'm not sure how it affects the way I live. I'm very thankful. I'm mindful of the conflicts that our country is getting in and the government's stance and what's at stake. And you haven't asked, but I'll just tell you, I think Vietnam was a huge mistake.
I was kidding.
Yeah, okay, well, I beat you to it. And I hope that there are lessons to be learned that are never forgotten. Huge costs to that war.
Could you explain where the mistake was made in Vietnam? Was it, what exactly went wrong?
My perspective?
From your perspective.
Well, I don't know that we should have ever been there to begin with. It was a play and part of the Cold War, okay, to contain the spread of communism worldwide. And the big players then were China and Russia. And we were trying to show that we weren't going to buy into their agenda. Was North Vietnam a threat to the U.S. borders? Was it a threat to anyone in the U.S.? I don't think so. Our government could never make up their mind whether they supported it or didn't support it. We had a couple chances to win it, and they pulled the bombing. And so the North re-strengthened and regrouped. Even if we had have won it, I'm not sure what it would mean today to the United States. But there are 58,000 plus names etched on a black granite wall in Washington, D.C. However, when I got back, I shared the story with Dr. Doyle. I had a friend that was teaching at Ball State, Dr. John Hewitt, in the criminology department. And I was meeting with John one time, and he told me that he taught a couple classes here on campus, and he taught a couple classes down at Pendleton at the state prison. And I said, criminology courses? And he said, yeah. And I said, really? He says, yeah. He says, actually, the Pendleton classes are my best classes. And I said, well, what do you mean they're your best classes? And he says, well, the students come and they're prepared. They've done their homework. They ask questions. They want to learn. They want to get something out of this. He says, whereas on campus, quite often at the beginning of a semester, a couple students will approach me and say, Dr. Hewitt, what do I have to do to get by on this course? And I said, really? I said, that's interesting. Well, tell me, who are these convicts down in Pendleton that are taking your course that are doing so well? Are they serial murderers? Are they rapists? Are they pedophiles? He said, clearly 50% or more of them are Vietnam veterans that just could not assimilate back into society after they got home. And I've never forgotten that. And I think the message that I take with this is we will never know the costs of that war. It's not just in body count, but it's in relationships and lives that have been trashed because of the experiences of combat, because of trauma, because when they got back they weren't accepted. I started changing my opinion about the war, Cameron, once I was over in the base camp and saw things that were happening. I saw corruption on the part of the military. We got a lot of infantry units in, and they had jungle rot on their feet. And the rules then were supposed to be, if you spend one day in the rice paddies, you don't walk on the dikes because they're booby-trapped. You walk across the rice paddies, which is underwater, a couple feet underwater. Then you're supposed to have a day to dry out so that you don't get the fungus and various things, skin diseases. A lot of these infantry units were in for 3 days in a row, their feet underwater. And the reason they were is because their commanders were trying to make rank. You can make rank very, very fast when you're in combat. You make rank if you've got a good record. A good record is body count, enemy body count. So if I keep my guys out pursuing the enemy, I'll look good. So here we go. We got these guys that have all kinds of funguses and skin diseases because their commanding officer is looking out for himself. They can't get enough dry boots to wear. I could be someplace going in my base camp and see some awful black smoke, putrid black smoke, which I did, and went over to see what was on fire. And there was a pile of brand new, just received jungle boots that had come into this unit that didn't have any use for them. So they were burning them. I said, well, why in the world are you burning them? And they said, because if we don't use them up, we'll be cut off. Our allocation will be stopped. So here they are, same base camp. One has excess, so they waste it, throw it away, tax dollars. Another needs it, and they can't get it. So I saw these sort of inconsistencies and things when I was in the military that really turned me off.
You spoke of trauma and of the people who could not reassimilate. Did you know anyone personally, you served with anyone you knew before the war who dealt with these issues? Anyone who would have been one of the convicts or like that?
Possibly. I know of one that went to Canada. He was a great student and a silver medalist in the high school high jump, the state meet. He was a heck of a student, a heck of an athlete, and he decided to go to Canada. I have a friend from IU that became part of the Sudanese Liberation Party that kidnapped Patty Hearst after he got back from Vietnam. So as far as talking to them or actually seeing someone that's had the post-combat trauma, I've not really experienced that, but my friend Bill Harris that's went astray when he got home. Who's to say what caused that?
You mentioned the War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Have you ever been there? Have you ever seen it yourself?
I saw the traveling one, the smaller one, that came through this area a few years ago.
Right. You also alluded to the present military conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan earlier. A lot of people liken them to the Vietnam War. Do you think that's a fair comparison, an accurate comparison?
No, I don't. And simply because, like I mentioned before, I don't know that the Vietnamese would have ever come over here with an AK-47 and had any intent on destroying America. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda have shown their intent with 9/11 and other bombings and so forth. So we are the infidels, and they wish to murder us. I think it's better that we confront them on their soil than ours. So I think there is a marked difference between Vietnam and Afghanistan.
Do you have any opinions on how those wars are currently being handled?
Well, I think that we need to listen to the people that are experts at fighting wars. And those are the military minds. Those are not the people in Congress that have never put on a uniform or served a day in their life. I think President Eisenhower said, if you're going to go into war, go in to win. I completely believe that. If you're going to fight, and that's your objective, don't mess around. Get it over with and win it. And who better to know that than the people on the ground that have been trained to do that sort of thing? So I would prefer that the direction come from the generals in the military as opposed to Congress.
Earlier, before the interview, you told me about your son. How many children do you have?
I have 2 sons.
2 sons. How old are they?
36 and 31. You didn't ask me the important part. 5 grandkids.
5 grandchildren?
Okay, now you can go on.
Have you talked with either your sons or, I guess, any of your grandchildren about your experiences in Vietnam?
I have not talked to any of the grandkids. They're little. They're 8 and under. And my son's very little about the conflict. I mean, I've talked to you more than I've talked to anybody about it here tonight.
Why is that they have not talked? Are you reluctant to, or are they just not asked, or?
I think they understand my reluctancy. They've tried to protect me. They've seen some Vietnam movies, Platoon and so forth, told me, Dad, don't go see that. So somehow through the years they have an appreciation for my stance, my viewpoint, my weaknesses, my vulnerability. And they haven't asked about it. And to be honest, Cameron, I don't know your experience because you and your group are interviewing a lot of Vietnam vets, but quite frankly, most of them that I know don't care to talk about it much.
I've encountered that. Do you keep in touch with other Vietnam veterans? Are you active in any veterans groups?
No, but I have recently qualified for some veterans benefits, being that I can get my prescription drugs a little cheaper than I can get them through my group insurance. So I've taken advantage of that for a couple of months, which is a perk, I guess.
Earlier you did liken the place you worked to that on the television show MASH. Do you think that it's a similar facility, but do you think it was an accurate depiction of what it was like to work in one of those places in any way?
Oh no, we in a racist type of way called American nurses round-eyed nurses, and we called Vietnamese nurses slant-eyed nurses. And we had no round-eyed nurses over there. We had a couple Vietnamese nurses that would help, limited training. The 3rd Surgical Hospital next to us that had more advanced medical training and doctors, surgical doctors on. They had surgical nurses that were from the United States. So that was more like the MASH was like. I mean, you know, you had all kinds of different situations going on the television show that didn't necessarily exist where we were. There wasn't the socialization. We had an officers club, and there was an NCO club, non-commissioned officers club. And you could go there in the evenings, and I think you could probably buy a beer for a dime, maybe a nickel or something like that. So that was the extent of our socialization. However, I do want to tell you about in Christmas when the Bob Hope show came through. And Bob Hope was there at Christmas. And he brought Ann Margaret with him. She was wonderful. The Rockettes, which was the dancing group from Radio City Music Hall, were there. Their Ned Hosing had holes and tears and everything. They'd been through it, really had. But they put on a tremendous show, and they did an awful lot for morale. It was really wonderful to see what he would do every year for the holidays for the guys overseas. I'll never forget that.
You mentioned that your sons have advised you not to watch movies like Platoon, but do you know much about how the Vietnam War is portrayed in film and television? Do you think there's any glaring inaccuracies, or they've gotten anything right?
I've only seen one, and that was one I shouldn't have seen, and that was Platoon. And it's pretty accurate. Pretty frightening. At least from my perspective. Now, you've got to understand that Vietnam was different depending on where you were and so forth. One day we had to go up to Saigon, I believe. And we got up as we did every morning, took a shower, put on clean jungle fatigues, and got in a deuce and a half, which is a large 2.5-ton truck, and drove up. And by the time we got there, of course, we were covered with sweat and dust because the windows were open. It was on our arms. We didn't look very clean. We went into an officers' club there. They were wearing TW's tropical worsted uniforms, which is a summer uniform that's has nothing to do with the war. It's an administrative uniform that you'd wear back in the United States, or khakis. They had an air-conditioned officers' club. They had a pizza machine. And as I hung around there for a day, they looked at us like, "Don't you bathe?" You know, and we got up and took a bath the same time you did this morning. But the only way they knew there was a war to read about it in the newspaper. So there were some areas that were very protected and very sheltered in Vietnam, and some that were just hellholes. So it varied a lot what your experience might have been over there.
Well, people in my generation, I'd say, are genuinely unknowledgeable about Vietnam. It's not quite long enough ago that it's taught in history courses, and the Cold War in general is not typically covered in grade school and high school. How would you explain the significance of the conflict too young, or for someone too young to remember the Soviet Union?
Well, there's enough history out there, and I think the Cold War is more of an issue than the Vietnam War, as far as knowing what the general climate, political climate was back in that area. The fear of the Soviet Union, who's got nuclear weapons, who doesn't, what they will do, what the provocation might be. You've got Castro in Cuba, just right off of our borders to the south. And there were enough movies made, enough books written, that I think you can sense the fear that went on from the Cold War. The spy versus spy stuff was very, very real. Back probably when your dad was a youngster, there was a television show called I Led 3 Lives. This guy was a U.S. spy and a Soviet spy, and who's going to discover him first, you know? That was the fear of the whole thing. The KGB, the whole thing. It's all very real. And if you watch any World War II movies or documentation, read about the SS, the Nazis. There is fear there as well. I think it's similar feelings at the time.
What misconceptions about the Vietnam War in general do you think people have?
Well, I think that there are Lieutenant Calley misrepresentations that the GIs went over there and went nuts and just put it on automatic and leveled the M16 at anything that moved. But then you can go nuts after a while when the little kids come up to greet you and they've got dynamite strapped on their back or grenades, and they're going to be detonated when they get within range, so you don't want a little kid to come up to you. But the last group that went through gave him some chewing gum, so he loves GIs. Now he's being used. So we didn't know who the enemy was. You know, you didn't know who you were fighting, and that can drive you nuts. And it did drive a lot of guys nuts. But to say that we were baby killers and leveling villages and burning them just because that was our mission is not true at all. War is hell. That's all there is to it. And it's an experience that I don't know how you can experience unless you try and educate yourself, but it's an experience I wouldn't want anyone to have if it can be avoided through diplomacy or other means. But here now, we didn't have terrorists back then. Now we got terrorists. That's pretty big, you know. So the whole thing has shifted, but it's still there.
How is the fear from the Vietnam era, the fear of communists, different from the fear of terrorism that we have today?
Well, I think that the communists was a form of government, state rule and ownership, and I think that was a philosophy of how the populace should be governed and who should own what, property, this sort of things. I think terrorists want to kill you. And they don't care if they take themselves, if they can take multiple infidels or the enemy with them. So there becomes that type of fear, because we can have terrorists inside of our borders, inside of our city limits. Here on campus, there can be terrorists. And you and I probably wouldn't recognize them until they revealed themselves through whatever means or got caught with what they were planning to do.
I want to go back to Vietnam. And in the aftermath of the war, like in the years since, Vietnam has rebuilt and it's becoming a modernized country to the point that tourism to Vietnam is increasing. Would you ever consider taking a trip back to Vietnam to see how the country is doing?
No, I wouldn't. And a lot of people think I'm missing the boat there. But for one, there are a lot of booby traps over there that haven't been detonated, haven't been found. And, you know, I've read some stories about some guys that were tunnel rats. They had to go down in the tunnels and look for the Viet Cong when they were there. They get over there and they've got to go back in a tunnel. I don't know why. I mean, a psychologist can play with that for a while and figure it out. I have no desire to go back. I know that there's some great products being manufactured in Vietnam, so they have some skills, and the cost of labor is right, so that we can benefit from that. But I don't have any desire to go back.
Do you have any final thoughts on your war experience? Is there anything you feel I neglected to ask you?
Not that I can recall.
Not that you can recall?
I hope there's been of some help to you.
It's been very helpful. If you had to sum up the lesson of Vietnam, what do you think it would be?
We need to have very, very clear direction on what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then once you make up your mind either to abstain or to go into it, go all the way. But we kept vacillating there. We were in, we were out. We were going to send more, we weren't. We were going to bomb, we weren't going to bomb. It just was, there was never any clear direction to win that war. I don't know that there was even a clear direction that we should have been in the war. So I'd say that we need clarity before we commit to anything like that again.
Where do you think the fault lay with that? Is it the politicians at home? Was it their decisions that made Vietnam the way it was, or do you think it was the generals?
Eventually it was both, but I think it probably started with the politicians. And here again, some of the brass, some of the military, at some point, told the politicians what they thought the politicians wanted to hear. And so that didn't help things either. So I think both sides were culpable, although I believe it wasn't when General Abrams took over and Westmoreland was replaced. We had a new counterinsurgency program in the, I believe, early 70s. Had we continued that, had we continued to fund that, I think we would have come out victorious. But we didn't. Politicians pulled it.
Well, I'd like to thank you for sitting down with me. I'd like to thank you for your service.
Certainly. Thank you.